The general's ship broke through Earth's atmosphere, the death world below looking deceptively serene. From the view of his command deck, the planet appeared as any other habitable world: blue oceans, green land masses, and swirling white clouds. Yet the reports he'd read, and the stories whispered across the stars, painted a different picture. Earth was a death world, the kind of planet most species avoided. Only creatures forged in relentless survival could live there, let alone thrive. General Gortha, a veteran of countless battles and conquests, had heard of Earth before. Its people, the humans, were the subject of conflicting rumors. They were physically unimpressive by most standards: no scales, exoskeletons, or natural defenses to speak of. And yet humans were whispered about with unease in the darker corners of galactic society. Their world, brutal and unforgiving, had molded them into something far more dangerous than their appearance suggested. Gortha, though skeptical, was here on orders. The Kroth Empire had learned that humans had developed a weapon capable of shifting galactic power, something so destructive that it demanded investigation. The humans had refused to share it, hiding behind their planetary defenses and diplomatic negotiations. So the Empire had decided to take matters into their own hands, sending Gortha to scout the planet and assess the threat. The general's ship landed softly on the outskirts of a dense forest, far from any human population centers. He was cautious. No one knew the full extent of Earth's hazards, and he didn't plan to lose soldiers unnecessarily. As the landing ramp lowered, Gortha stepped out, his armor gleaming under the harsh sunlight. Around him, his soldiers spread out, establishing a perimeter. The air was thick with humidity, and the ground underfoot felt unstable, as though Earth itself resisted the presence of outsiders. It wasn't long before Gortha noticed the oddities. The forest around them was far too quiet. His soldiers, seasoned veterans themselves, shifted uneasily, their weapons drawn and ready. The first sign of Earth's hostility came that night. As darkness descended, Gortha's troops set up camp. It was then that the native wildlife struck. It started with strange sounds, rustling in the bushes and distant howls that sent shivers down even the general's hardened spine. Then came the attack. Creatures, vicious and agile, burst from the underbrush, tearing through the camp. Their fangs and claws gleamed under the moonlight, and their eyes glowed with predatory hunger. Gortha's forces fought valiantly, but they were taken by surprise. The creatures, despite their size, moved with an unnerving speed and intelligence. Several soldiers were wounded before the beasts were finally driven off. Gortha watched, impressed despite himself. These weren't even the humans, just the wildlife of this planet, and already they had tested his forces. He ordered his troops to regroup, but the encounter had shaken them. Earth was alive in ways they had not anticipated, and it had become clear that they could not afford to underestimate this planet or its inhabitants. Gortha felt a growing sense of unease, but he refused to show it. This was just the beginning, after all. They hadn't even encountered the humans yet, nor their weapon. As they regrouped, the general pondered the day's events. Earth was relentless, a living entity that seemed designed to break those who dared tread on its surface. Yet the humans thrived here. What kind of species could not only survive but dominate such a hostile world? Gortha had heard of other death worlds before, but none were spoken of with the same reverence or fear as Earth. There was something different about humans. They weren't the strongest species by far, and yet they were feared. Their resilience, their adaptability, these traits made them dangerous. The general had seen many foes fall in the face of overwhelming force, but he suspected that humanity was different. Their strength didn't lie in brute power, but in their sheer will to survive. And a species like that, one shaped by a world like Earth, was not to be underestimated. As dawn broke, the general gathered his officers. They needed to learn more. The wildlife had been an obstacle, but it was nothing compared to the threat of the humans themselves. The Kroth Empire could not afford to be caught off guard. He ordered reconnaissance teams to venture further into the forest, seeking out any signs of human technology or habitation. As they ventured deeper, the landscape became even more treacherous. The forest was dense, filled with towering trees and thick underbrush that seemed to shift and twist, as though the planet itself conspired against them. Yet Gortha's forces pressed on, driven by the need to uncover the secrets of Earth. Hours passed, and then came the first breakthrough. One of the teams reported back. They had found something. An abandoned human outpost, tucked away in the forest, overgrown but intact. The structure was rudimentary by cross standards, but functional. It was a military facility, though it had been deserted for some time. Gortha ordered his scientists to begin analyzing the outpost. They uncovered strange devices, primitive yet effective, designed for communication, surveillance, and combat. But what truly caught the general's attention were the records. Stored in the facility's database were logs detailing human military operations, strategies, and tactics. As Gortha reviewed the data, he began to understand why humans were so feared. Their approach to warfare was unlike anything he had ever seen. They didn't rely on superior firepower or numbers. Instead, they fought with their minds. They exploited weaknesses, used the environment to their advantage, and employed psychological tactics that would break an enemy's morale long before the first shot was fired. It wasn't about strength, it was about resilience. Humans adapted to their enemies, to their environment, and even to their own weaknesses. They turned disadvantages into opportunities, using the chaos of battle to outwit their foes. This was the real weapon of the humans, their ability to endure, to survive, and to overcome any obstacle, no matter how insurmountable it seemed. Gortha's respect for humanity grew as he delved deeper into their methods. He realized that Earth had not just shaped humans physically, it had shaped their minds. And in a galaxy where brute force often determined the victor, humans were playing a different game entirely. The general felt a growing sense of dread. If this was how humans fought, then their weapon, the one the Kroth Empire feared so much, was likely something far more terrifying than anyone had imagined. The reconnaissance teams moved cautiously through the dense terrain, their scanners sweeping the area for any signs of the elusive human weapon. General Gortha waited back at the temporary camp, reviewing what little information they had on human military strategies. Though the humans' records were sparse, what they did have painted a picture that was difficult to comprehend. Human warfare was unlike anything he had encountered before. When the first reports came in, Gortha noted that his troops had located an abandoned human military base. From the outside, it appeared mundane, perhaps even primitive by galactic standards. The Kroth Empire had always prided itself on advanced technology, and to the untrained eye, the human structures seemed unimpressive. As his soldiers explored the base, they found signs of past activity. The facility seemed built to withstand more than just enemy attacks. It was as if it had been designed to outlast the very environment around it. Earth's brutal, ever-changing conditions had shaped human technology in ways that the general's engineers were only beginning to understand. Gortha's team started uncovering human military logs, training programs, and schematics. The more they discovered, the more perplexing it became. The humans had clearly put immense thought into their strategies, but it wasn't the kind of strategic thinking that Gortha's people valued. The Kroth Empire valued efficiency, overwhelming force, and precision. Humans, however, seemed to thrive on something else: chaos. Their plans were often convoluted, layered with traps and contingencies that seemed designed not just to win, but to completely dismantle the enemy's will to fight. It was as if every human tactic was a test of endurance. Psychological operations played a huge role in their strategies. They didn't just fight with weapons. They fought with ideas, manipulating the battlefield in ways that seemed almost unpredictable. At first, Gortha struggled to see the point of such complex maneuvers. Why bother with such elaborate schemes when a decisive strike could end the conflict faster? But then it dawned on him. The humans weren't fighting just to win, they were fighting to survive. Every aspect of their warfare was shaped by their environment, by the unforgiving world they called home. Earth had turned them into survivalists, and survival was about more than brute strength. It was about outlasting your enemy, outthinking them, breaking them down piece by piece until they could no longer fight back. Gortha's scientists continued analyzing the data from the base, uncovering more about the human military mindset. They found logs detailing combat drills that emphasized adaptability. Soldiers were trained to fight in a variety of conditions, from extreme cold to blistering heat, from high-altitude warfare to underwater operations. Their resilience was staggering. These were not fighters who relied on the safety of their technology alone. They used everything at their disposal, the land, the weather, even their own bodies, as weapons. There was something else, though, something more unnerving. Human soldiers were trained not just to kill, but to endure. Their endurance training was rigorous, pushing them to the brink of what seemed physically possible and often beyond. The logs showed that human military commanders deliberately placed their soldiers in extreme situations designed to break them mentally before they even engaged in battle. But instead of breaking, the humans adapted. They hardened. The result was a force that didn't just survive, they thrived in adversity. What Gortha found most disturbing was the subtle psychological edge the humans had. In their training, there was a significant focus on the mental aspect of warfare. They weren't merely taught to fire weapons or follow orders, they were conditioned to think creatively under pressure. Instructors would force soldiers into unwinnable situations, making them solve problems on the fly, often with no clear path to victory. It wasn't about defeating an enemy head-on, it was about outlasting them, eroding their morale and will to fight. And that's where Gortha began to realize the real threat posed by humans. Their weapon wasn't just some piece of technology hidden in this facility. Their true weapon was their ability to take what seemed like chaos and turn it into an advantage. They didn't follow predictable patterns. They didn't rely on strict strategies. In fact, they thrived in the unpredictable, in the fluid, chaotic nature of battle. As the data continued to come in, Gortha reviewed the human approach to psychological warfare. It was more terrifying than he had anticipated. Humans use fear as a weapon, not in the way other species did, with threats or intimidation, but by making their enemies doubt themselves. They made their foes second-guess every move, making them feel vulnerable and unsure even when they were in control. It was as if the humans understood that the mind could be a battlefield just as important as any physical one. The logs revealed that human commanders deliberately let their enemies believe they had the upper hand, only to turn the tables in ways that seemed almost calculated to inspire panic and despair. They used deception masterfully, planting seeds of doubt in their opponents until they became paralyzed by their own fear. Even the strongest armies could crumble when faced with such uncertainty. And that was the brilliance of human warfare. They didn't just fight their enemies, they made them fight themselves. Gortha felt a cold realization settle over him. The humans weren't just dangerous because of their physical resilience or their harsh world. They were dangerous because they had learned to weaponize their very nature. They understood how to manipulate fear, how to turn it into a tool that could break even the most disciplined soldiers. And if they had developed a weapon that could amplify this psychological edge, then the Kroth Empire was facing a threat unlike anything they had ever encountered. The general knew they had to tread carefully. This mission had just become more complicated. The humans didn't need brute force to defeat their enemies. They could dismantle them from the inside out. And if their weapon was anything like their tactics, it would not be something his forces could counter with sheer firepower. The Kroth Empire had underestimated the humans. Gortha now realized that the real challenge wasn't in finding the weapon, but in understanding the mind behind it. Earth's warriors were forged in fire, tempered by a world that demanded adaptability, creativity, and an unyielding will to survive. That made them far more dangerous than any simple calculation of strength or technology could account for. As Gortha continued to review the data, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, even out here, in this seemingly abandoned part of the planet. The humans had an uncanny way of staying one step ahead. They thrived in the unknown, and Gortha was starting to see that he was walking right into their world. He wasn't just dealing with another military force, he was dealing with the product of a planet that had perfected the art of survival. Gortha's mind raced as he prepared for what lay ahead. Gortha and his forces approached the location of the human weapon with heightened caution. The facility they had uncovered seemed unnervingly quiet, almost too calm. It was nestled in a barren stretch of land, isolated and without any visible signs of defense. The silence was unsettling, the kind that made every soldier in his unit grip their weapons a little tighter. Gortha had seen enough of human tactics by now to know that this was deliberate. The humans didn't need to flaunt their power or position. They preferred to lure their enemies into a false sense of security, only to strike when the moment was right. As they entered the facility, Gortha felt an almost imperceptible shift in the air. His troops, disciplined as they were, began to move with less confidence. Something was wrong. The corridors were narrow, winding, and the deeper they went, the more oppressive the environment became. Gortha's finely tuned senses, honed from years of battle, screamed that they were walking into a trap, but there was nothing tangible to act on. No alarms, no visible threats. Just a growing sense of dread. Suddenly, one of the soldiers near the front of the group stopped, his eyes wide with panic. He raised his weapon, pointing it toward the empty air, muttering incoherently. Before anyone could stop him, he fired wildly, the energy blasts ricocheting off the walls. The others quickly subdued him, but the damage was done. The soldier, visibly shaken, was dragged back, unable to explain what he had seen. Gortha didn't need an explanation. He knew what was happening. The weapon wasn't physical, at least not in the way they had anticipated. It was psychological. He could feel it now, creeping in at the edges of his mind, an overwhelming sense of fear that had no rational source. His soldiers were beginning to experience the same, whispering nervously among themselves as they pushed further into the facility. Their discipline was starting to crack, and it wouldn't be long before chaos overtook them. The Kroth Empire had faced many weapons of mass destruction, but this was something different. This wasn't designed to kill bodies, it was designed to break minds. As they moved deeper into the facility, the effects grew worse. Hallucinations began to plague the soldiers. One claimed to see the walls closing in, another was convinced there were enemies lurking in the shadows. Some simply froze, unable to move as terror took hold of them. It wasn't just fear, it was pure, primal panic, the kind that bypassed reason and instinct, leaving nothing but the urge to flee. Gortha knew that retreat wasn't an option. His mission was clear: find the weapon and neutralize it. But now he understood why the humans had been so confident in their defenses. They didn't need turrets or shields when they could turn an enemy's own mind against them. The weapon was the culmination of everything he had learned about humanity over the past few days. It was an extension of their world, dangerous, unpredictable, and relentless. He could see now how Earth had shaped its people. The humans had mastered fear in ways no other species had. On their planet, survival wasn't just about fighting external threats. It was about controlling the mind, understanding that the greatest battle was often the one within. This weapon wasn't just a machine or a device, it was the embodiment of that philosophy. It took everything they feared, every weakness, and magnified it until it consumed them. One of the officers approached Gortha, barely holding himself together. His normally calm demeanor was replaced by a look of desperation. "General," he began, his voice trembling, "we need to fall back. We can't fight this." Gortha glanced at his remaining soldiers. The cracks in their discipline were growing wider with every passing minute. Some were muttering to themselves, others clutching their weapons with white-knuckled grips. He could see the fear in their eyes, the same fear that was gnawing at his own resolve. But they couldn't leave. Not yet. They had to press forward. He gave the order to continue. It was met with hesitation, but no one dared disobey. They moved deeper into the heart of the facility, where they hoped to find the source of this psychological assault. The air grew heavier with every step, as if the very atmosphere was closing in on them. The fear was becoming unbearable. Even Gortha, who had seen horrors across countless battlefields, felt his composure slipping. Suddenly, they reached a large chamber at the center of the facility. At the far end, a sleek, black device stood on a pedestal, humming quietly. This was it, the weapon. It didn't look like much, but Gortha knew better than to underestimate it. The device was surrounded by human technology, screens and consoles displaying information that was impossible to interpret. But the weapon itself radiated an aura of malevolence, as if it was feeding off the fear that it generated. Gortha approached cautiously, his soldiers staying close behind, though many were visibly shaking. As he neared the device, the hallucinations intensified. The walls seemed to ripple, and he could hear whispers in the air, faint, unintelligible voices that tugged at the edges of his sanity. He forced himself to focus. He had to understand how this weapon worked if they were to disable it. His scientists began scanning the device, trying to make sense of its design. But the fear was now overwhelming. The soldiers were barely holding together. Some had fallen to the ground, clutching their heads, screaming incoherently. Others stood frozen, eyes wide with terror, unable to move. Gortha's own mind was teetering on the brink, but he refused to succumb. Then it hit him, the true genius of the human weapon. It wasn't just about inducing fear. It was about magnifying it, turning every soldier's deepest insecurities and nightmares against them. This was no ordinary weapon of war. It was a tool designed to break armies without ever firing a shot. The humans had perfected psychological warfare to such an extent that they didn't need to outgun their enemies. They could simply let their enemies destroy themselves. Gortha made the call to retreat. They had found the weapon, but there was no way they could neutralize it in their current state. His forces were too compromised. As they fled the facility, the fear gradually lessened, but the damage was done. His soldiers were shattered, their minds scarred by what they had experienced. As they made their way back to the ship, Gortha couldn't shake the feeling of defeat. Not just because they had failed to destroy the weapon, but because he now understood what the humans had truly created. This wasn't just a weapon of war, it was a statement. The humans had taken everything that made their planet so dangerous, everything that made them so resilient, and weaponized it. Earth had forged them into something more than just survivors, it had turned them into the galaxy's most dangerous minds. The Kroth Empire had never encountered anything like this. Gortha knew they couldn't afford to underestimate humanity any longer. The humans had found a way to turn the very concept of fear into a weapon, and in doing so, they had changed the rules of war. As the ship lifted off from the surface of Earth, Gortha looked down at the planet below. It was no ordinary world, and its people were no ordinary species. They had become something far more terrifying than anyone in the galaxy had imagined. As the ship ascended into orbit, General Gortha remained silent, his mind replaying the events of the last few hours. The psychological assault they had endured weighed heavily on him. His forces were barely functional, seasoned soldiers reduced to shivering wrecks, still trying to shake off the residual effects of the human weapon. He knew that this was not just a military defeat, but a personal one. He had underestimated the humans, and now he understood why they were so feared. Back on the command deck of his ship, Gortha reviewed the data they had managed to gather. The weapon had no obvious weaknesses. Its effects were subtle but devastating, targeting the mind with precision. There were no defenses against it, not shields, not armor, not training. His scientists could find no clear way to counteract the psychological devastation it caused. The humans had designed something that transcended traditional warfare. Gortha sat down in his private quarters, staring at the holographic map of Earth projected before him. He had been sent here to evaluate a threat, and now he had no doubt about the severity of that threat. The Kroth Empire could not afford to engage in open conflict with humanity. This weapon alone could decimate entire fleets without a single shot being fired. If they tried to invade Earth, the cost would be unthinkable. The humans had proven that they didn't need to rely on superior numbers or raw firepower. Instead, they weaponized something far more primal, the fear that existed within all beings. It was a masterstroke of military design, built not just to kill but to break the will of entire armies. For the first time in his long career, Gortha felt genuinely outmatched. And it wasn't by a larger army or a stronger fleet. It was by the minds of a species shaped by a death world that had taught them how to manipulate survival and fear like no other. He recorded his report for the Empire's High Command, detailing the events and his recommendation. The humans should be approached with extreme caution, if at all. Any attempt to force them into submission would be disastrous. Their willingness to use this kind of weapon suggested they had little regard for traditional galactic norms of warfare. They operated on a completely different level, driven by the need to survive at any cost. He noted in his report that the humans were not conquerors by nature. If they had been, the weapon they had created would have been used already, and the galaxy would be a very different place. No, humans weren't out to dominate through sheer force. They were defenders. Protectors of their world, and now, Gortha suspected, protectors of their position in the galaxy. They had mastered survival, not just physically, but mentally. And that made them far more dangerous than any species he had ever encountered. The High Command would likely be skeptical of his findings. They were a proud people, confident in their military superiority. But Gortha knew they would have to listen. He had seen it with his own eyes, felt it in his own mind. This was not an enemy that could be defeated with traditional tactics. The humans had learned how to dismantle their foes from within, how to weaponize the very essence of fear and uncertainty. They had found a way to turn the battlefield into a psychological minefield where every step forward brought their enemies closer to destruction without ever needing to fire a weapon. It was ironic, really. Gortha had spent his entire life on the front lines of galactic wars, facing down countless enemies and never once considering that the greatest weapon might not be something you could see or touch. The humans had changed that. They had shown that the mind, when pushed to its limits, could be far more dangerous than any fleet or army. The humans didn't need to conquer, they needed only to defend. Their very existence on Earth, on a planet that would have killed most other species, had turned them into the galaxy's ultimate survivors. As the ship broke through Earth's orbit and into the vastness of space, Gortha reflected on the lessons learned. He had come to Earth to face a weapon, and he had found it, but it wasn't what he had expected. It was far worse. The humans themselves, forged by their harsh world, were the weapon. Their ability to endure, adapt, and manipulate fear was unmatched. Any force that underestimated them would face total annihilation, not through firepower, but through the collapse of morale, through the destruction of will. That was the genius of the human design. The Kroth Empire would have to rethink its entire approach to the humans. Any aggression would be met with devastating consequences, not just in terms of lost soldiers, but in the sheer psychological toll it would take on their forces. Gortha knew the truth now. The humans were not to be trifled with. They had taken the very essence of survival and turned it into their greatest strength. And they had done so with a precision and ruthlessness that few in the galaxy could match. He signed off his report with a final, somber note. Under no circumstances should we engage humanity directly. Their weapon is not what we anticipated. Their weapon is their mind. The message was sent to High Command, and Gortha leaned back in his chair, exhausted but resolute. He had learned the hard way what it meant to face a Deathworld species. They didn't need overwhelming numbers or superior firepower. They had something far more effective, the ability to use fear as a tool, a weapon that could destroy armies before a single battle had even begun. As the ship's engines hummed quietly, pulling them away from the blue and green planet, Gortha couldn't help but feel a deep respect for the humans. They had mastered the art of war in ways no one else had, and in doing so, they had secured their place in the galaxy as a species not to be trifled with. They didn't need to conquer, they only needed to survive. And in that survival, they had become the galaxy's most formidable defenders. The Kroth Empire would think twice before ever underestimating Earth again. And Gortha, a seasoned veteran of 1,000 wars, had learned one undeniable truth: humanity's greatest weapon wasn't anything they had built. It was who they had become.